In the past, I've made quite a few videos about people who were arrested, fined, and even imprisoned for listening to or being caught in possession of a radio scanner. Radio scanning, or more specifically listening to any transmission that isn't intended for you, is against the law in the UK. But what about those who transmit illegally? I've trawled the Ringway Manchester archives to bring you some stories you've probably never heard before that involve these sorts of cases. They're stories that have been lost to time and can't be found on the internet. To protect the privacy of those involved, I'll only use their first names in some of these stories. Radio enthusiast Brian Bochamp's illegal broadcasts were heard as far afield as northern France when he decided to set up an illicit radio station on a disused airfield near Corby in Northamptonshire in 1987. But as Bochamp operated from the station using the fictional call sign Romeo Tango 2, he came under the covert surveillance of the Department of Trade and Industry officials who were out to bust him. Michael Lewandon, an officer with the DTI, received signals from the illegal station on April 14, 1987, and using monitoring equipment, he traced them to Desborough Airfield, a former RAF station in Kettering. Unknown to Bochamp, Lewandon and his team watched as he broadcast from the cab of a pickup truck. Using monitoring equipment, he could hear Bochamp speaking to someone who said he was in northern France. Fixed to a disused hangar was a large aerial. The transmitting equipment was illegal because it operated too near to frequencies used by emergency services in this country, said Mr. Lewandon. The DTI, armed with all the evidence they needed, decided to obtain a warrant to search the airfield, and later Bochamp was twice observed while he broadcast. On the second of those occasions, on May the 28th, several DTI officials and 2 policemen moved in, and when quizzed, Bochamp admitted his radio equipment was not covered by the CB licence he held, and that he was transmitting illegally. At Corby Magistrates Court, Bochamp, then 38, admitted setting up a station without a licence at Desborough Airfield between February and April 1987. He also pleaded guilty to 4 charges of illegally using a radio transceiver between February the 1st and May the 28th, 1987. He was fined a total of £250, ordered to pay £100 costs, and magistrates ordered that all the radio equipment should be confiscated by Her Majesty's Customs and Excise. In court, Bochamp, who was not represented, agreed the radio transceiver was illegal, but claimed the rest was not, and asked for the magistrates to return it to him. I'm in the process of applying for an amateur radio operator's licence, and I would be able to use it on these frequencies, he said. A radio amateur who we'll call Oliver was tracked and busted by Department of Trade and Industry radio investigation officers in late 1989 after he was found to be transmitting on frequencies they claimed were used by submarines. The officers picked up illegal transmissions in the Llanelli area of Wales in April 1989 and used direction-finding equipment to home in on the signals. When they approached Oliver's property, they noticed a large V-shaped antenna in his back garden. They raided his house and seized several pieces of equipment, including a homemade transmitter. He pleaded not guilty at Llanelli Magistrates Court to using a radio transmitter without the appropriate licence. The call sign he used was Oscar Bravo 55, and the prosecution put forward the theory that Oscar Bravo were his initials and 55 was his age at the time, which seemed to fit. The prosecution really went down the route of the serious consequences that could have been caused by using the particular frequencies Oliver was, and that they were used by submarines on exercise and by civil and military airfields. It's unclear what the frequencies actually were. I did think it was maybe the 6.6 MHz Echo Charlie frequencies, which are aeronautical channels used by pirates, but this doesn't fit the submarine theory. Oliver denied all knowledge and didn't remember what he was doing on the day Leonard Williams and his team of investigators descended on the property. Either way, he was found guilty, fined £250, ordered to pay an additional £250 in costs, and had all of his equipment seized. I couldn't find Oliver's call sign, but I do have his full name. He'd be 90 if he's still around today. A radio amateur illegally ventured onto frequencies reserved for government communications one evening back in 1990, but just minutes into his conversation with another Fife radio amateur, there was a knock at the door. Government radio investigators had quickly swooped on his home to close down his communications. Kirkcaldy Sheriff Court was told on July 1st, 1991 that the 58-year-old amateur, who we'll call Leslie, was halted just 18 minutes into his illegal broadcasts in October 1990. He was ultimately accused of installing and using transmitting apparatus without a government licence, as well as designing and adapting the transmitters to broadcast on illegal frequencies. He admitted both charges. The authorities were concerned about his transmissions because they may have interfered with messages made by emergency services. They said that the band in question was reserved for government and meteorological use and was not legally accessible by the public. His defence said he was in possession of an amateur radio licence for the 5 years leading up to the incident and wasn't in the habit of making use of his illegal equipment. They claimed his friend had asked him on this occasion to switch bands, and he'd, quote, stupidly done so. They claimed he'd only been engaged in conversation for a short period of time before the officers arrived at his house, but this was either untrue or he'd done it before, as I don't know of any other case where the door is kicked in after just 18 minutes of chatter. It's my opinion that Leslie had done this numerous times before and was being monitored. The authorities seized £3,000 worth of equipment from his home and he was fined £500. Again, his full name doesn't yield an amateur radio call sign, and he'd be around 92 years of age today if he's still around. Michael was unaware that his transmissions were jamming emergency services when he broadcast from his flat and car back in the summer of 1979, but at Sheerness Magistrates Court in the July, he was fined £100 after pleading guilty to using a transceiver without a licence. I'm so very sorry. I realise now that somebody could have died while I was broadcasting, he said. Mrs. Jean Austin, prosecuting on behalf of the Home Office, said that the calls were made by Rubber Bullet, a name not registered. They went out on the Citizens Band radio, which was illegal in this country at that time. Transmissions were sent from Michael's home in Sheerness, but not traced to him when police saw the radio set when making inquiries on another matter. The court heard that he'd not taken the examination set by the Home Office. Successful candidates would pay a licence fee of £7 and were allocated a call sign. He was broadcasting on 27 MHz and using airspace reserved for hospital radio and the control of model cars and aeroplanes. Mrs. Austin said the transceivers were used quite widely in other countries, especially in America, and those in use in England had usually been smuggled in, as Michael's had been. He bought it in Amsterdam for around £45, and the components to repair it were also purchased abroad. When first questioned, he said the set was broken, but he had a good working knowledge of radios and was able to repair it. He admitted fitting it into his car and broadcasting as he travelled, as well as in his home. Customs and excise officials seized the set, and Michael eventually went on to sit the amateur radio exam. A radio enthusiast from Bridlington, who we'll call Sergeant, found himself in court after his broadcasts affected the television reception of his neighbours. The 48-year-old man was charged with installing and operating wireless telegraphy equipment without a licence between January and February of 1998. Sergeant was given a 1-year conditional discharge with £100 in costs and was ordered to forfeit all of his radio equipment seized during the investigation. The prosecution was brought about by the Radio Communications Agency, the government body which managed radio use in the UK before Ofcom replaced it. They received a number of complaints from TV viewers in the area suffering from interference. The agency's technical staff visited Sergeant's home on February 2, 1998, and seized several items of transmitting equipment. A spokesperson for the Radio Communications Agency said complaints were made about interference caused to the television reception in the area. The people who complained pointed out Sergeant as the most likely cause of the interference. When the agency called at his home, they found a great deal of transmission equipment which he wasn't licensed to use. He was also transmitting on a frequency which he wasn't supposed to. Do you remember any of these stories? If you know the people involved, please don't mention their full names in the comments. I've left them out to protect their privacy. I'm sure that during the decades that have passed since these incidents, they've grown up and would rather forget them. If any of you happen to be watching, I'd love to hear from you.